reporting for James Cole. Today we are going to be talking about how you either overcame or are navigating living with a mood disorder and what your advice is to other people who might be seeking that out. So first of all, this is very broad and you can speak about specific instances or whatever makes the most sense for you. But when was your first kind of understanding or grasp that what you were dealing with was not just run-of-the-mill sadness or, just variations in mood, but just something that you should actually seek concentrated help for?
Yeah, I think, growing up, I had like moments of sadness. Like since I've dealt with depression more seriously and like talked to loved ones and so on, like my mom is like, yeah, when you were a little kid, like you would talk about the sadness. When I was like 5 or 6 years old, like I would just feel sad sometimes for like a day or two, just like inexplicably. It wasn't tethered to anything. It was just unexplainable sadness. And I've always been a very anxious person. So these things like anxiety and depression that we talk about societally, I think we all feel them like here and there. But I always described it like a fly that you're kind of, it's an annoying thing that. Is your cat causing problems?
She is, but like I said, we'll deal with it later.
So I always thought of it like a fly, where like it was a sad feeling that I could kind of like, with some things that bring me joy, like spending time with friends or socializing. As I got older, like, I don't know, having a really good coffee or going for a run or like doing happy things, I could kind of like shake it, get rid of it. Same thing with anxiety. Like I'd be stressed, but like I'd just go to bed early or I'd like excuse myself from the party or situation that was making me anxious. And then when I was 25, I'd never had a therapist before. I started seeing one because I was dating a woman who my therapist told me was a sociopath. And I had like a very traumatic, intense, charged relationship it was only like a 6-month relationship, but it like totally rocked me. And I went from like these feelings of depression and anxiety being sort of like annoying things that would come and go in my life and sort of distract me here and there to like for several months on end, like barely being able to get out of bed, like going from being a top performer at work to almost getting fired, like my life basically like going off the rails. People talk about addiction sometimes and they'll be like, it's addiction when it's taking a toll on the rest of your life. If you're able to like have 3 drinks a night and like have it not affect anything else, you're not addicted, is sort of people's benchmark. And I'd say the same for anxiety and depression. Like if you're just a little sad or a little stressed, like you could have like lowercase a anxiety or lowercase d depression. But I'm very open about my mental health and my mood disorder. And so a lot of people will call me that are in the closet about it. And they'll be like, oh my God. And they'll describe how they're feeling as if they're the only person on planet Earth that's ever felt this way. And I felt the same. Like there's no way that other human beings feel this terrible. There's no way. Like I feel like death right now. And that's what bad anxiety or bad depression feels like, where it's literally an all-consuming hell. And I think if you haven't felt that before, when you first feel it, which I hope most people listening don't, it feels like such a unique experience because it's so different than normal life and society and discourse. Like it's such a foreign and perverse way of feeling. So it started when I was 25 is the short answer to your question. But I remember judging people prior to that who couldn't seem to deal with the ups and downs of life, because for me, the ups and downs were manageable. And then they got to a point where they were absolutely not manageable, and like entirely all consuming. And I realized like how serious these things can be.
Speaking of that judgment, that's, it is very novel for people to still be open about the fact that they misjudged a lot of just mental health issues. So looking back on that, what were some of the ways in which you were judging other people? And reflecting now, how were you wrong?
again, I mean, like I dealt with like very, very, very benign depression and anxiety my whole life. And so I was like very able to deal with it just by like, as I said, sort of injecting a little bit of happiness or like taking a little better care of myself, even as like a 13-year-old or something, like just being like, oh, I'm not feeling so happy. Like, let me do something that makes me happy. Okay, now I'm a little happier. But like when you have real depression, nothing helps, right? Like the things that brought you joy, like someone you really love and care about. I think I've mentioned on this video series, like I'd be at dinner with my girlfriend, you know, a year ago, and it'd be a really nice dinner and I'd be miserable. Or I'd be on a walk with my dad. You know, my parents live on a farm, and I'd be visiting and we'd be on this beautiful walk in a field with the sun shining. I'd be miserable. So when it's really bad, there's no way to fix it. And so I think what I judged people for when I remember in high school or middle school, there was a girl who was like really dark. She sort of, you know, would be goth and like cut herself and was just really like troubled. And I pitied her and felt badly for her and, you know, sympathized. But I also sort of judged her, like, why can't you work through this? Like, why can't you find a way to be happy? Why does everything need to be so dark? Right? Like I sort of thought that she had more of a choice and that she was sort of choosing to live down there, when in reality, she probably just had, I haven't kept in touch with her. I probably should reach out to her, but she probably just had depression or, you know, a mood disorder of sorts, and like couldn't help but live down there.
What was the turning point for you to actually seek help?
Just like, again, like going from it being this thing that I, you know, was sort of distracted by here and there to like barely being able to get out of bed, just feeling acutely miserable, like the worst you've ever felt in your life, which is usually a passing feeling where you like go to bed early and you feel better the next day, for like sustained weeks on end. You know, I remember being at work at this big ad agency in Midtown, and they had showers in the building for people that wanted to like work out before work or after work or whatever. And I take like 3 showers a day in the middle of the day, like the equivalent of splashing water on my face, just trying to like wake myself up, like get out of it. I would spend like hours walking through Central Park because the building was on Central Park, like trying to like get my head to stop buzzing, like trying to lift the heaviness off of my chest. Like I'd go for like a 2-hour walk in the middle of the workday, or take 3 showers, or like go and get ice to try to eat ice to try to like, you know, I remember like frantically Googling things that would help and reading about like fish oil and like all, you know, vitamin D, and buying all these supplements and having them on my desk and just taking fish oil all day, like just frantically trying to, it's tantamount to like on a hot day, that trope of like sticking your head in the freezer because like you can't escape how hot it is outside, like trying to get safety from this storm and feeling like there was nothing I could do. I wasn't safe anywhere. That was one of the scariest feelings. Just like one day I left work at noon and I like came home and just curled up in bed in the fetal position. And I had what I considered then to be like a really cool apartment. I was living with like 2 of my best friends. It was in the East Village. It was like this hip, you know, kind of, it was cheap, you know, it was like a walk up in kind of a seedy part of town, but it had exposed brick, and I laid my room out just how I liked it. And I felt really cool. And I remember looking around that room on that day and being like, this is a room, like I'm doing it. Like I'm living this awesome life in New York City, working at a like fancy company, you know, living in a sick apartment in a cool part of town with my best friends. Like that's nirvana. That's what a 22-year-old should want, you know, from where I come from. And despite all of those trappings, like despite this amazing life, I was not just like a little unhappy, like miserable, like acutely in pain. And that was so terrifying because I had all the boxes ticked. I was doing everything right. Like I'd followed the rules of society and done all the things that you're supposed to do to have a happy life. And I was miserable. So that's when it was like, I'm not able to go to work and like be a good employee. I'm not able to like be present in my friendships. I want to curl up in bed and just like be in the fetal position. Like I'm a shell of a human. Like I need to do something about this. So it wasn't like I was sitting there stroking my beard. I guess I didn't have one in those days, saying like, is this a problem? Should I like get this? It was like, you know, a big fucking problem. Like my life was in shambles. So it wasn't, by the time I went and actually started seeing a therapist and started like really addressing this, it wasn't even remotely a question as to whether or not it was a problem.
What did, seeing a therapist, and what did help look like for you in the early days, and how has that progressed since then?
I think when you let it become that, if you're having like an acute episode, if you're like acutely depressed, talk therapy is really unhelpful. I guess you have this initial relief of like someone knowing what you're going through. Because when you tell your friends or family, and most of them don't know what depression actually is or feels like, you don't really, they love you and you're like, I'm so sorry that you're going through that, but they don't really get it. And having someone understand it and actually have seen it before and like really use language that indicates to you that they actually understand what's going through your head and your experience of the world. Like we've talked about reality before, Ella, on this series. And it's very weird where depression can completely warp. Once again, I could be in a field on a sunny day with my father. Like that's a really nice thing objectively, and feel miserable. So it just takes reality and like bastardizes it. Things that should be really nice or amazing aren't. So going to a therapist and having them understand what your reality is like, share in your reality and actually be like, I know what you're feeling and going through. There's a little bit of relief that comes from that. But like when you're in an episode, nothing helps, nothing at all, really. And pretty quickly he pushed medication on me, this therapist. And I was very resistant because of the stigma and just fear of taking stuff. What's your cat's name?
Her name is Olive.
Olive. So it doesn't help right away. He pushed meds on me. I was very resistant. It probably took him a month to convince me. I took a benzodiazepine. It scared me. I read all about how addicting they can be. I went on an SSRI, which everyone goes on. It's like a very common drug. It's sort of the drug if you're a class of drug if you have depression. And then I broke up with this girl who was really causing the acute trauma. And I got it to go from being like an absolute emergency to, through breaking up with her and starting an SSRI, I got back to sort of like, -2, let's say. I might have been at -9 out of 10. And normally I was at a 2 or 3, and I was at a -2. So I was back to a place where I could function as a human being, thanks to the meds and thanks to getting rid of the stressor.
And how's that shifted in the years since? How's your just treatment progressed, or what
I basically stayed there. I stayed on an SSRI. I'm actually going off of it right now. So I stayed on it for 5 or 6 years. And there have been ebbs and flows and ups and downs. But basically I've sort of lived at like -2 for the past 5 or 6 years, where like talking to a therapist once a week when I was in New York, and then maybe once every 4 weeks when I moved to San Francisco by phone, and then taking an SSRI. That was sort of like my life for the past 5 years. There are 3 things that affect your mood at any given time, Ella, which people should know. Your bio, your psycho, and your social. Your bio is your biology, your brain chemistry, your genetics. Your psycho is your psychology, your upbringing. And your social are like your present day stressors, work, relationships, family, finances, whatever's sort of causing you strife. And so those 3 things for everyone coalesce. Everyone has some bio component if they're feeling crummy. Everyone has some psychological component, which is like something in their upbringing fucked them up a little bit. And everyone has some social stressors. And some people are way skewed in one direction. Like it's very much a biological thing. and they're not really affected by the other two. I tend to be, my conceptualization of what I have is about 50% bio. My grandfather was bipolar. I have lots of like great grandparents that committed suicide, and like there's mental health in my family. So biologically, I'd say like that's 50% of what causes my depression. I'd say like 30 or 35% is psychology, my upbringing, and 15% are stressors, are like social. I have a pretty high stress threshold. So I can like put up with a lot of abuse from work or from any number of other things that cause me stress or strain, I think more than most, just because I was raised in a very high intensity environment. Whereas other people might be completely broken by stressful circumstances and have no biological underpinnings, right? So how you treat the condition has to do with the breakdown of those things. So one of my biggest social stressors is relationships, intimacy. And so when I'm becoming intimate with a romantic partner, I tend to be very strained. You know, I just put a lot of pressure on myself, and it causes a lot of mental health problems for me. So I had my most serious relationship ever with my ex, and looking back on it was like pretty chronically depressed through that whole experience, with moments of very acute anxiety or depression along the way that I tried to muscle through because I thought she was going to be the person that I was going to marry. And when we broke up and I moved back to New York, I was like, I really need to handle this. Like, even without her in my life, living at a -2 is no way to live. Like I'm able to function. I'm able to, like, to the outside world, I seem fine, but I don't feel fine. And every single day of my life, every day is marked by depression. It's called dysthymia. It's like chronic sort of low grade depression where you're not curled up in bed, but like you just don't feel happy most of the time. And that's how I've been for the past 5 years. So I'm like, I need to fucking fix this, and I'm not going to stop at anything. So I've tried everything in the book. Ketamine, which is a very popular treatment right now, where I went to like clinics and got IVs of ketamine and tripped balls. And, you know, like that's a really, really popular, it's getting a lot of buzz right now as like the new breakthrough in depression treatment. So I've done 10 doses of ketamine. I've done microdosing mushrooms. I've, you know, meditated, I've journaled, I've exercised, I've taken SSRIs, MAOIs, you know, stimulants, what else? Antipsychotics. You know, I've tried 12 different drugs. I've tried every form of non-invasive sort of like lifestyle changing thing. I've given up alcohol. Like I've tried everything. And it became my number one priority in the past year, is to fix this and to like get to the bottom of it and to stop at nothing. And I've made really immense progress, but I've thrown the kitchen sink at it. Like I'm more dedicated to my mental health than anyone I know, which is quite an intense statement, but I do 7 hours of therapy a week still, 7 hours. I take 4 meds now, and I've tried 12. I meditate, I journal, I eat well, I sleep well, I drink very minimally, if at all. I'm obsessed with my mental health and trying to fix this. And seeing how hard it is to actually fix the problem. And then there's a whole nother layer we can talk about, which is privilege. So I have 3 doctors that I work with, 2 on a regular basis and 1 once a month. And I'm happy to get into that, but they're all outside of insurance and all very expensive. There's certain drugs that I've been prescribed that my insurance wouldn't cover and were hundreds of dollars a month. You know, so I've spent a lot of money on my mental health. And something that makes me shudder is like, even my friends that are a little bit more cost conscious, they're not poor by any means. but they need to see someone inside insurance coverage. They couldn't afford the $300 a month pills. Watching them struggle through it is scary. And then knowing that there are many rungs beneath that, where a guy in West Virginia who has no money at all, there's a stigma against seeing a therapist, can't afford pills, that he's just dealing with his anxiety by drinking or taking drugs. Like, that's most of America. So mental health is like, the pharmacology is very broken. I have a big problem with big pharma and how antidepressants are marketed. I think they're very poorly marketed, and I think the wrong drugs are being pushed forward. Talk therapy, the best in the world are very good, but most people are quite bad, and most people have access to pretty mediocre therapists. So if you're an average person dealing with a mood disorder, the chips are very much stacked against you, and it's very, very, very hard to overcome it.
How, I'm curious, you said that you've been kind of operating at this -2 baseline level for a number of years now. And so these years have also coincided with, as you're building your company and trying to establish yourself in this way, how has that impacted the work that you're doing? And how do you kind of balance all of that out?
Yeah, it's impacted it immensely. I mean, I think all the time about like, what would my relationship with my ex have been like? What would my company look like if I didn't have depression? Or, for example, if I just fixed it to the extent that I have now. Like, I would say I'm at a +5 now. And I feel like a totally different person. And the company is an interesting thing to have, because most people don't have a mirror in their life, like a way of externalizing themselves. But my company is still small enough where, like, when I'm on fire, the company does really well. And when I'm like slumping, the company slumps, because it's still so small that it's tethered to my life force. If I'm working 80 hours a week for a month, like, the company will show that. Whereas most people work at a big company, and like, you working at Teen Vogue, like, if you have a month where you're a little off, your boss might say something or whatever. It's not like Teen Vogue's like stock goes down, right? Because of like one person. But at a small company, whether it's me or Shannon or other people at my company, it's so small that if any of us are off, the company will reflect that pretty, visibly. So I've seen my company lurch forward. I've seen my relationships improve. I've seen, like, fixing this mental health problem. I've seen the benefits of it, which then begs the question of, like, what the fuck were the past 5 years? Like, what if I'd been operating at +5 instead of -2 for the past 5 years? And it's sort of a haunting thought, and the only way I get out of it, well, one way I get out of it is like, it is what it is, right? And then the other way I get out of it is like, this brain, very neurotic, very anxious, prone to depression. There are a lot of like bad things, but this same brain, very creative, very high energy, very passionate, very like, and buying into this sort of romanticized trope about mental health, that it's like the same DNA strand. It's two sides of the same coin. Like, my therapist always says, like, I don't want to over medicate you, right? Because you'll lose things. So my greatest gifts, and the reason, if my company's succeeding, the reasons that it is, at least due to my contributions, are because of gifts that I have that are part and parcel with the same things that cause my depression. That's how I view it. So I sort of am like, this is the price that I have to pay for my gifts.
And I'm curious too, you've mentioned that, there being a stigma, and there still very much is a stigma around seeking help for mental health, though it is diminishing in a lot of spaces lately. I'm curious, what do you see as an entrepreneur, like the benefit of you standing here and saying, I need help for my mental health? And what can other entrepreneurs kind of take from that?
What do I see from it? I mean, first of all, it's very liberating for me, right? Like, I'm a big fan of turning the lights on the boogeyman. It's like a phrase that I made up. And it's like when you're a kid and you're in your room and you're like, there is a monster in my room. And then you turn on the lights and it's actually just like a sock that's on your lampshade that like made the shadow that looked scary, or like you check your closet and no one's in there. And then you're like, cool. Or like if there is a monster, then I guess you could like deal with that. But like lying in the dark, fearing a monster and you don't know what it is or where it is or if it's even there, just turn the fucking lights on and figure it out. So I'm a big fan of being like, I don't feel well. Instead of like denying it or drinking it away or hiding it, how can I turn the lights on and be like, let's look at the fucking problem. I will see 3 doctors. I'll take 12 meds. I'll do whatever the fuck I have to do. I'll do ketamine. I'll microdose mushrooms. I'll do whatever the fuck anyone tells me to do. I'll try it to try to fix this problem. So a lot of what I get out of being honest about my depression is just like destigmatizing it for myself. Like not lying in bed scared of the boogeyman, but just knowing the size and shape of the problem makes it a little less scary, because it's just something that I'm aware of and I know what it is and the effect it has on my life. And that gives me freedom and as much power as I could possibly have in the situation. And then the second thing is like giving back to other people, right? Like I was so undereducated when I first started dealing with this. Like one of my friends is actually like a sort of ex of mine, sort of, you know, we had like a brief relationship and we've stayed friends. She called me, I hadn't talked to her in a couple months, and she's like, I need to tell you something, and was like very hesitant and like came out of the closet as like, I have really bad anxiety. And she started describing it to me and using language that was like, she was astonished. She's like, no, like it's so bad. Like, and she like, I like my chest is like doing this and I'm sweating and my heart's beating out of my chest and I can't get it to stop and my head's swirling. And I'm like, listen, I hate to break it to you, but you're describing garden variety anxiety. Like you have GAD, generalized anxiety disorder. This is, you know, 1 out of 8 Americans have American adults have a script for benzodiazepines, which solve this exact problem. Like there are millions of people that are lying in bed right now feeling exactly as you are. And like, I deeply understand what you're going through and let me empathize with you and love you and care for you. But at the same time, I need you to know that this isn't some thing that you and only you are experiencing. You're not alone in this. It's not like bizarre. You're not going to die. This is really common, unfortunately. So trying to help other people, Ella, and like trying to destigmatize it, trying to educate. Like I spoke to her for 2 hours and walked her through everything I know on the topic and what I think she should consider. What order should she approach this? How should she solve the problem? What things should she put in place? And so trying to like help others learn what it took me like 5 years to get to in like a month, so they can like address the problem. And one last little anecdote on this. This is super intense, dark, and personal, but I'll share it. My grandfather just died, and I was, you know, on like by his deathbed, and he was unconscious at this point. But he was diagnosed with bipolar, you know, like 50 years ago. And my take on it is that we have very similar genetics, and I don't have bipolar. I don't think he had bipolar. I just don't think they knew enough to like correctly diagnose him. But he took lithium, which is a common bipolar, still used for bipolar, and like several other drugs throughout his life. Was very closeted about it. Our whole family doesn't talk about it. And I said to him on his deathbed, like, listen, you know, legacy, like you live on, you will live on, like your genetics are inside me and I feel them in a lot of different ways. But one thing that I have that you also have is this depression. And I want you to know that I'm beating it, and that society has risen up and like science has gotten better. The drugs have gotten better. The stigma's gotten better. Like everything's gotten better. And I want you to know that I'm going to have a better life, you know, and that it's gotten better. And I want to be on my deathbed and have my grandson come and say like, I was feeling depressed and I did XYZ, and a month later I feel totally normal and I'm back to full strength. So it took me 5 years. It took my grandfather a lifetime. And I hope that my grandson, it'll take a month, you know? Yeah.
How have you seen either the stigma against, seeking help for mental health or just having a bad day and kind of really struggling through it manifest through work, either when you were at companies where your bosses didn't understand, or if, colleagues or investors just seemed really resistant to this idea of something being, more than something that you can just kind of like hack your way out of?
It's really hard, right? I mean, like as a business owner myself, I've seen employees through a whole manner of things: deaths in the family, breakups, mental health, like pretty much anything bad that could happen to someone has happened to one of my employees over the past 5 years. And as like a caring person, like your first instinct is to be like, oh my gosh, like you're going through a breakup, like take some time. Or, oh my gosh, you're like depressed. Like, let's, how can I help? Right. But as a business owner, like there's a line, right? Like if that person is going through a breakup and needs to take a week off, for sure. If for the next like 2 to 4 weeks, they're like a little out of sorts, for sure. If 6 months later, they're still underperforming at a small company, that's a problem. And so, businesses on the one hand need to understand this and be supportive of it, right? And like give employees in the same way that if they had the flu, like it's not like you're expected to come into the office if you're feeling super depressed and need a week off or need to leave early one day. Like I think that should be normalized. But by the same token, if the depressed party is not able to manage it and they're consistently underperforming, then I think at some point they sort of give up their spot, right? And that's like, that might not be a popular thing to say, but I don't think it's like a capitalist entity, like a business's job to carry someone you carry them a little bit for a week, a week in a big way, like take a week off, and then for 2 to 4 weeks in a small way. But if they're not taking care of themselves or figuring out how to get back on the rails so that they can perform, then they're not sort of holding up their side of the bargain. So then I don't think the business is obliged to anymore. We could talk about government's role, or like how can mental health be, how can access to decent therapists, how can access to medication that's expensive be fixed? I think that's way more, say, like the government's role than it is private institutions.
I'm curious if you've seen anything, like if you've kind of either been on the receiving end of it yourself, or if you've just witnessed something just in your own past, just thinking more tactically than ideologically, because some people might respond to, these examples a little bit more concretely.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at my company, I won, sorry, at Y&R, at the big ad agency I worked at when I first dealt with depression, I won an award for the top like young person at the company. Like they gave me like a bonus, and it was like an award that I won. It was like a big deal. And then 6 months later, I was in my boss's boss, the head of my department's office, with him saying like, "What's going on? Like, are you okay?" And he was very loving. It wasn't an aggressive meeting, but it was probably the first of 3 or 4 where I would have been fired, He was basically being like, you very clearly are not performing to the level that you once were. Is there an explanation for this? Do you want to share? Was sort of the conversation. I can't even remember what I said. I was so depressed. Like I don't think I said like I'm dealing with depression. I think I probably explained a little bit. I felt so embarrassed and bad. And I quit the company like 2 months later. So I never let it get to a point where the company had to carry me or they had to make a decision of whether they should fire me or not, because that would have been so mortifying for me. So I just fired myself. Like I just quit. So I never really got to see how a big company handles something like this and what they would have done. Ad agencies are sort of notorious for not firing people. They don't pay very well, and they sort of let people cling on to the bottom rung for a while. So underperformers are kept around, which I actually don't think is a good way to run a business. But my sense is they probably would have kept me around for a couple months. I would have had a few more meetings like that. And then at some point they would have been like, you should probably leave, and like sort of encouraged me to quit. And I think that's what they should do, right? Because like I was leaving work at noon. I was walking in the park for 2 hours a day. Like I wasn't working hard because I was hurting. And then on owning a business, you know, I've had 1 or 2 employees, 3 employees, maybe with that have shared 4 that have shared mental health things with me. And I'm very, very, very actively supported, like, you know, because I've gone through it and I so deeply understand. So their instinct is always to fight through it, right? Like, I want you to know that this is a thing. And for them to admit it to me, their boss, is a big deal, because there still is stigma, right? It must be really bad. It must have gotten to a point where it's really affecting them. If you're just having a little scratch of depression, you're not going to talk about it to your boss. If you're bringing it up to your boss and like asking for a meeting and being like, I'm going through this, it's really bad. And so always I'm like, take time off immediately. If I can help, like, here's some things that have helped me, like, and immediately I'm trying to help, you know. One of the girls couldn't shake it, and she was in it for a while and just wasn't happy in life, but at the company, like, she just wasn't happy. And so it wasn't me like firing her so much as me just like talking to her about it and being like, you're not happy. Like, this isn't bringing you joy. This is hurting you more. It's adding stress to an already bad situation. And it was really me, like, as her friend, like, just as someone who wanted to see her be happy, being like, you shouldn't be here. Like, you maybe shouldn't be working at all right now. Like, take some time off. And she did, and she's much happier now, and we're very close. And I've never fired anyone for having mental health problems. And most of the people, after a week off or after, like, they sort of are able to get back on the rails. You know, I've helped one employee with medication, talking through that, which is weird. Like, as a boss, you know, that's like a line that I probably shouldn't be crossing. In fact, she saw a really fly-by-night therapist who made some medication recommendations that I thought were really bad. And so I'm like, listen, I'm saying this as your friend, I don't think that they're doing it right. You should be way more conservative. The dose they told you to take half of it. And she's ended up going even lower. So just to go into the weeds for a second, because this is super interesting. SSRIs are prescribed very widely for depression. They only work 40% of the time for people trying them for the first time. Then you have to try other SSRIs and so on. For 14% of people, SSRIs can be very, very activating, which manifests as sort of like jitteriness, stress, anxiety. So you can feel anxious. And most shrinks will then prescribe benzodiazepines like Xanax. So they're like, oh, you have depression, so I'm putting you on an antidepressant. Now you're seeming anxious, so I'll put you on a benzo. And now you're on both. The better move is to half the SSRI dose to test to see if maybe it was just overly activating and you need a little bit less of it before moving to the benzo. But we in America have this tendency to just throw drugs at problems. It's like, oh, you're depressed? Depression, antidepressant drug. Oh, you're anxious now? Cool, we'll give you that too. And that's how someone ends up on a very high dose of an SSRI and a very high dose of a benzo, when in reality their anxiety was exacerbated by the SSRI in the first place. So I kind of helped an employee through that because I thought the shrink was jumping too quickly through the process, starting her on a really high dose of an SSRI and then trying to throw a benzo at her. And I'm like, no, half the SSRI, don't go on the benzo, like, take it one step at a time, because otherwise you're going to wake up in 6 months on high doses of 2 very powerful drugs and you might not need them. So test it first, right? It's like things like that. So yeah, I've been in the weeds with a lot of employees. I've never fired anyone over their mental health or close to it. One employee has quit ostensibly due to her mental health.
entrepreneurship is also just a very high stress job or jobs or whichever the case. It's just a very high stress track, I guess is the good word, by nature. And there can be a lot of variables and a lot of risk that we've talked about before, especially given that, 90% of startups fail. And so I am curious, what benefit do you see for people looking to become entrepreneurs and to come into this knowing that sometimes it's okay to admit that whatever stresses you're going through is not just the day-to-day stresses of that company?
So, what's interesting, Ella? You can look this up if you want to add it to the article. There's an incredibly high instance of anxiety in founders, depression in founders, ADHD in founders. ADHD, I think it's 6x higher than Gen Pop. Bipolar is 9x more likely for a founder to have bipolar disorder than Gen Pop. I think it's genetic. I don't think it's bio, not social. So what do I mean by that? I mean, for someone to be an entrepreneur, you have to have a certain makeup. Like you have a certain risk tolerance, a certain energy level, a certain way of thinking existing. And I think those genetic markers are often accompanied by trait neuroticism, trait openness, trait extroversion. So if you're neurotic, if you're extroverted, if in other words, the things that make a good entrepreneur are often heavily correlated with like attentional issues, high energy and low energy, like sort of bipolarity. So I don't think it's that being an entrepreneur makes you stressed, makes you depressed or anxious. I think it's that being an entrepreneur genetically is highly correlated with being someone who's prone to anxiety, depression, and bipolarity genetically. The stress certainly doesn't help and it exacerbates the problem, but I think I was born an entrepreneur and I think I was born depressed.
What benefit do you see about just the population or the community of entrepreneurs being more open about this predilection or these correlations?
I think just like any community, like being honest about the trappings, the successes, the excitement, and then also being honest about the shortcomings and the challenges. Like we've talked about in previous videos, a lot of the lies of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship has been branded in the past 5 or 10 years as this like amazingly highfalutin, exciting, dynamic existence, which it can be. But there's so many ugly parts of entrepreneurship. There's so much loneliness. There's so much failure. There's so much self-doubt, depression, anxiety, bipolarity, all these things right? So I don't know. I think like a more honest conversation amongst entrepreneurs or future entrepreneurs around entrepreneurship, which is ostensibly what this video series is, Ella, is like me, and I'm just one guy. Like I'm even getting used to like calling myself an entrepreneur, and I actually really do think I am one. But like I played a lot of sports and I never called myself an athlete, right? I did a lot of photography, but I never called myself an artist. I feel like titles like that, you have to respect them. Like it takes a certain level to be an athlete. And I feel like I've crossed that level. I feel like I deserve to call myself an entrepreneur. But yeah, entrepreneurship is this sexy thing that a lot of people want and strive for. There's so much ugliness and loneliness and terror and bad things too. And so part of why I wanted to do this with you, this series, is to shine a light on my experience just as one person. But like, let's talk about some of these things. Like, let's really be honest about what it's like to be an entrepreneur. And I'll talk about all the cool things and awesome things and things that I've gotten out of it, which are immeasurable, but also the negative things, like the fact that I'm depressed, and that I think that I have a propensity to be, or a proclivity, as you said, to be depressed, just like I have a proclivity to be highly creative and passionate, as you need to be as an entrepreneur.
And then my last question for you is just that, societally, our generation and the generation under us we have higher cases of anxiety or diagnosis anyway of anxiety and depression than ever before. And I'm curious your thoughts on, is that a result of the world we're living in? Is that because you think we're being more open about it? Is it a mix of the two? And what can our generations just kind of either stand to learn or gain even from navigating this together?
It's a combination. I need to read the literature on this more, Ella. My instinct, based on nothing other than just living with this disease and knowing a lot of people that do, as I've been more open about it, and also living in the world of technology, a lot of it's being more open. Like it's just less stigmatized. In some circles, like where I lived in San Francisco, it's almost trendy to like be working on your mental health, talking about it, and so on. So that accounts for some of it. But I would say, like, I would give that, to pick an arbitrary number, a 50% increase in the numbers versus 20 years ago, right? And there's, in certain demos, like 16-year-old women are like 350% more depressed, or more of them are depressed than 10 years ago. So I think a huge percentage of this is, how addicted we are to our screens, how lonely we feel, how excluded we feel, how we feel that other people have it more figured out, feeling like we're detached from society or reality or what we should be doing, is ever like, it's just a huge problem. So I think like the vast majority of the delta, like why more and more people are depressed and anxious, has to do with social media, with how connected we all are, and yet how alone we all are. And I think something needs to be done about it. I mean, 50 to 75,000 people a year commit suicide. This year, probably double that given COVID, right? And that's just the people that kill themselves. I've never wanted to kill myself, but I've been really, 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 really miserable, like inhumanely miserable, for like a week or two at a time, like barely able to move. So if 150,000 people kill themselves, how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people can barely move at times during the year? And how many people are living at -2? 1 out of 8 Americans, adults, have a benzo script for anxiety. 1 out of 14 have an SSRI. Like, spit and you'll hit someone who's struggling. Like, it's everywhere. And it's not talked about enough. And the infrastructure isn't in place. Once again, like, I've thrown the kitchen sink at this. I spend 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, like meaningfully focused on my mental health, meaning like hardcore in therapy or hardcore meditating or hardcore, like doing things actively to fix my mental health, 20 hours a week, thousands of dollars. Like, it's been a huge priority for me. And even that has just gotten me from -2 to 5. So I can only imagine the person that's at -5 and doesn't have the money or time to properly address this, or it lives in a society where it's stigmatized.
Perfect. Well, I do have to go. So we almost hit an hour. So that takes time today.